should we be intermittent fasting or should we just be restricting our calories? Are they the same thing?
Well, there's different tools available to allow for us to eat ad libitum, but still meet optimum nutritional intake. One tool is intermittent fasting, that is, or time-restricted feeding, which we've practiced for 40 years, which is basically don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed at night. So instead of eating right up to the time you go to sleep, you withhold calories after the last meal so that you have 3 to 4 hours of fasting every day. That gives you a 12-hour fast every day. And if you're trying to lose weight, some people believe you could extend that fasting period another 4 hours in the morning, do some exercise in the morning, preferentially burning fat. And so that would give you a 16-hour fast and limit your feeding window to 8 hours.
And what's the benefit of that?
Some people find by limiting the feeding window, they can limit some of the overeating. That a lot of eating is being done for reasons other than being hungry. Sometimes people at night, they've had a big dinner and now they're eating additional food, not necessarily because they're hungry, but because they're bored, they're tired, or they're fatigued. And sometimes when they're fatigued and they eat and they feel stimulated, they think, oh, they must have been hungry, when in reality they were tired. Our suggestion is when you're tired, go to sleep. And when you're bored, engage in productive activities. And when you're hungry, then you eat. And if you limit your feeding window to 8 hours, some people find that it's a helpful tool at minimizing some of the overeating. Now, it's not going to work for everybody. If you have very high caloric needs, you're a competitive athlete, 8 hours feeding window, particularly on high nutrient density, low caloric density foods, may not give you enough feeding window in order to get the calories that you need. When you're trying to burn 3,500, 4,000 calories a day on very low caloric density foods, you may need to have a 12-hour feeding window in order to be able to get the calorie density need. But for most of us that are trying to maintain or lose weight, having a narrow feeding window may prove to be of some benefit.
When I'm in a ketogenic diet, or when I guess I'm fasted, which is very rare, why is it that my cognitive performance seems to be significantly better? Because when people have heard me say this so many times, but it's so true. When I'm eating, a normal Western diet, my ability to articulate myself and think and be creative seems to be diminished. Whereas when I'm avoiding carbohydrates and sugar, I seem to be able to think and talk better.
I think, again, it may not be that the ketones are helping you think better. It may be that the sugar vacillations are interfering with your cognitive function. For example, when people eat particularly refined carbohydrates, their insulin levels go up, drive the sugar down, they end up with low blood sugar levels, which can interfere with cognitive function as a consequence of this vacillation that's taking place with their blood sugar levels between insulin and glucose. When you go on a ketogenic type of an approach, or you're in a fasting state, everything's very stable as far as glucose is concerned and insulin is concerned.
Okay, so you don't want to be on the sugar roller coaster if you're doing important work.
Getting stable seems to help people in their cognitive function. So,
people talk a lot about juice fasting. And I don't know, there's something about when people say that they're on a juice fast, I always think, oh, God, you're going to be missing important nutrients. You're not going to be getting the same quantity of protein necessarily. Maybe, I don't know, your gut microbiome is going to pay the price if you're restricting yourself from having certain things. Is juice fasting advisable? Is it a healthy approach?
So juice fasting isn't technically fasting, because fasting is the complete abstinence of all substances. It's a modified form of eating. So it's a diet that's high in sugar, very low in fiber, virtually no fiber on these juices. Where it can be helpful is people that are trying to make dietary changes and they're addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in their brain that comes from the use of their highly refined diets. They're trying to make a change. They're trying to make a break. And because it's sweet and very appealing, they'll drink the juices. They'll get their 600 or 800 calories. They'll feel relatively satiated. And it allows them to avoid the greasy, fatty, processed foods that sometimes they're trying to get away from. Personally, I think that water fasting has advantages over juice fasting in terms of the magnitude of the detoxifying effect, the impact that it has. But the advantages to juice fasting, or what they call juice fasting, is that it can be done without modifying medications. You're still in a feeding physiology. It can be done safely by people without having to be in a controlled setting like you would for water fasting. So there's advantages to the intermittent or modified fasting approaches. It's not the basis of the research that we've published, which is actually water-only fasting. We're fasting people on water only from 5 to 40 days.
5 to 40 days. So tell me about that then. So who exactly would you prescribe a 40-day water fast to? And presumably in those 40 days, they have nothing but water.
Right. Patients that are fasting in our facility are on fractionally steamed distilled water only. That's the only thing they take. They're not taking supplements, medications.
What is that, fractionally?
Oh, it's, distilled water, so it's purified water, highly purified water. So in our case, we're using distillation. Some people use reverse osmosis, different ways of getting all the hydrogenated halocarbons and the chlorine and everything out of the water. So just essentially what rainwater would be if the environment wasn't polluted.
Okay.
Now, in fairness, not everybody's a good candidate for that type of fasting. In order to determine if you're a good candidate, obviously you have to review the medical history and take a look at what people are doing in terms of their medical treatment, particularly in terms of medications. Basic laboratory testing to make sure kidney and liver function are intact or capable of adapting to fasting. And when people fast, they need to rest. If people are active, we've already mentioned, they'll increase their weight loss, but that weight will be derived from breaking down lean tissue. We want to minimize lean tissue, maximize fat, particularly visceral fat. It's also important that they be monitored because people do have issues that can be aggravated by fasting. Fasting presents a dehydration response. There's a physiological dehydration that occurs with fasting. There's changes in electrolytes. So you need to make sure that people are being monitored appropriately. And then the most important part probably is they need to be refed progressively.
Refed?
So when they're eating after the fast, if they go back to too rapid a refeeding, you can get into a problem with post-fasting edema. You can get refeeding syndrome. That could be a very serious or even potentially, fatal problem. That can be completely avoided by following a reasonable protocol of a realimentation after fasting, which is the reason why we encourage patients that are doing fasting to do it either in a controlled setting or under some supervision so that they don't make catastrophic errors in terms of how they do it.
When it's that length, when it's long?
Well, water fasting, we're doing fasting anywhere from 5 to 40 days. So anywhere in that range, you want to make sure the person's a good candidate, that they're fasting in a controlled setting, that they rest, and they refeed properly. So a person that has, say, a 20-day fast would have 10 days of controlled refeeding. It'll take about half the length of the fast to properly realiment after the fast so that you're ready to go back to hopefully a whole plant food, SOS-free type diet.
And when you say SOS, you mean sugar, salt, and oil for context?
Yeah, SOS is the international symbol of danger, but it also stands for the chemicals added to food that make people fat, sick, and miserable, and those are salt, oil, and sugar.
What kind of candidate would come to your clinic to do a 5 to 40-day water fast? What are the symptoms they have? What are the diseases, illnesses that they're suffering with?
Well, we get a variety of people and ages. The conditions we see are often the conditions that we've published papers on because that's what people know us for. So one of the most common conditions is high blood pressure. We did a study with our colleague T. Colin Campbell. As I mentioned, 174 people in a row were able to achieve normal blood pressure without medication. We also did a prospective study recently with a colleague from the Mayo Clinic recently that we did 27 people completed fasting with hypertension. 26 were able to achieve normal blood pressure without any medication. One required half their dose of medication. And we had 6-week follow-ups where they did well. And then we followed them at a year. And we found that 76% of those people a year later had maintained their weight loss, and the majority were still normal blood pressure without medication.
Were they still fasting after a year?
No, of course, they were fasting while they were at the center. They were back eating a healthy diet, and they'd maintained a healthy enough diet for a year that they were able to maintain their blood pressure and their weight loss. And that's very unusual because you don't find good long-term follow-up showing that people are not only able to get well, but sustain those behavioral changes.
So it's more of an intervention in that regard. And how long were they fasted for, those people?
So the people in that study ranged, the average fasting was about 2 weeks. So they had 2 weeks of fasting that normalized their blood pressure, a week of refeeding, and then even a year later, the majority were able to sustain the behavioral changes such that they were able to keep their weight off and they were able to keep their blood pressure down without the need for medication.
And what's going on there? Because there's physiological changes that take place. If I went and did a 40-day water fast with you, there's some physiological things that can happen. Of course, I'm going to go into ketosis. My fat's going to start to become my primary fuel source. But there's also going to be a physio-psychological relationship. There's going to be something that happens in my psychology. I mean, you talked about dopamine. My brain is going to change in some respect. My relationship with food is going to shift in some respect.
Absolutely. If you look at the outcome data, for example, we've got studies we've done with DEXA scanners that look at body composition changes during fasting. And so people that would fast for 2 weeks would lose 10% of their total body weight, 20% of their total fat, but 40% of their visceral fat.
Visceral fat being the bad fat inside the
Yeah,
organs.
the 10% of fat that produces the inflammation that's thought to contribute to disease. Those same people would have only lost 6% of their lean tissue. Now, what's
Lean
interesting,
tissue.
like muscle, water,
Okay.
non-fat tissue.
Yeah.
So the lean tissue mass at 6 weeks was fully recovered, so that the percentage of their lean mass was actually higher at 6 weeks than it was at baseline. But the fat loss continues. So even though they're gaining weight after fasting, because they're putting their glycogen back in their muscles, which is about 2 pounds, they're rehydrating, they're putting fluid in, they're putting fiber back in the gut. So the scale's going up. But the fat loss, even with that weight gain, is continuing down. And so what you look at is their whole body composition begins to change. And also their brain composition too, probably, in terms of their functional relationship to themselves. For one thing, a lot of people feel that any kind of pain is a bad thing. Any kind of pain is a bad thing, and pain must always be avoided. If they have a pain, they have to take a pill, they have to do something, because pain's the evil, issue there. Athletes learn that pain isn't always bad, that sometimes discomfort can be associated with a positive response. We find it's easier working sometimes with athletes than people that have not been athletic, because they've learned to push their body a little bit. And fasting creates a hormetic effect as well, whereas there is some physiological stress that's introduced. That stress is associated with a healing response.
Would it not just be healthier if it were simple to take those people and remove all the processed food from their diet and then keep them on like a Mediterranean diet with like high protein, high fiber? Would that not be a more healthy intervention? Because at least then I'm not going to lose, you mentioned there I'd lose 6% of my lean tissue. At least then I wouldn't lose any muscle necessarily.
Well, I would agree that if your only goal is weight loss, diet and exercise are the key. Fasting introduces not just a chance to lose weight, but specifically to mobilize visceral fat. You will eventually mobilize that visceral fat with exercise alone. There's an advantage to getting rid of that sooner rather than later, particularly for people that have high blood pressure, diabetes, autoimmune disease, because the sooner you get rid of the visceral fat and the inflammation, the sooner you can get them off the medications. The medications themselves present their own problems. And people don't understand, if you have high blood pressure, you're being medicated not for your high blood pressure, but for the diet that causes the high blood pressure. Literally, the day you change the diet to a health-promoting diet, the need for medication begins to reduce. And if you don't reduce the medication adequately, you can actually shut people down from, consequences of excess medication.
Is there a different advantage between me doing the fast, the water fast, versus just going on the ketogenic diet if I was trying to reduce my visceral fat, which is that sort of stubborn fat around your organs?
Yes, water fasting is a more efficient method of mobilizing specifically visceral fat. And the other problem with when we talk about a ketogenic diet, remember there's a lot of different ways of getting into ketosis. You can do it with a high-fat, high-protein diet, which is commonly advocated. The dead Dr. Atkins diet, Ms. Philips, soul rest in peace, or those kind of programs. Those have some disadvantages. High protein, particularly high animal protein, is actually thought to be one of the major contributing factors to many of these health compromises, including cardiovascular disease and cancer and inflammation and the rest of it. So we need protein. It's an essential nutrient. You need about 10% of your calories from protein. When you get excess protein, you put yourself at risk for kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, and other problems. We need fat. Essential fatty acids are a critical part of our ability to be healthy. And you also need carbohydrates. You're designed as a carbohydrate burning machine, but you get all the fat, all the protein, and all the carbohydrates you need from a whole plant food diet. You don't need to eat large amounts of animal foods. You don't need to eat oils. You don't need to eat refined carbohydrates to get the foods you need. And in fact, a whole plant food SOS-free diet gives you the quantity and quality of nutrients you need without some of the negative consequences or the risks of dietary excess that come from these more processed modern diets.
So if you were to pitch to me the unique selling points of a water fast at your clinic versus any other intervention, medical or lifestyle, it would be the speed in which you're able to burn visceral fat and the speed in which you're able to lower blood pressure is unlike anything else.
It also reduces insulin resistance. There is no drug that reduces insulin resistance, but fasting does. And a significant percentage of our type 2 diabetics will achieve normal blood sugar levels without the need for medication with fasting. Again, if you do diet and exercise consistently enough, long enough, you're likely to get many of the same benefits. There are some things, though, that seem to change in fasting that don't change as well with these modified feeding regimes. For example, fasting, when you have a computer and it gets corrupted and you turn it off and you turn it back on and you don't know why, but now it works. You've kind of rebooted or flashed the memory, whatever it is. Fasting does a similar thing in humans, it appears, and particularly when it comes to the gut microbiome. So you've got a trillion creatures, trillions of creatures living just in your intestinal tract, particularly bacteria, but all kinds of organisms that are an important part of your digestive mechanisms, your immune response. And they're different depending on what you eat. So if you're eating animal-based diet, you have different organisms than if you're on a plant-based diet. If you're on a high-sugar diet, even fruit sugars and things, you get different organisms flourishing than you would if you're in a fasting state. In a fasting state, there's a big drop-off in total organisms. And then when you refeed, depending on how you refeed, you can actually regrow those organisms and repopulate that.
I'm right in thinking if you do a water fast, you're going to wipe out a lot of the bacteria in your gut, including the bad ones, but also some good ones.
Right.
And then you can reintroduce certain foods that will bring back the good bacteria.
That's why refeeding after fasting is so important. If you refeed carefully, you have a chance to reestablish that normal microfloral balance. And that may be why we see such good response in many of these GI-related conditions, like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease and chronic constipation, irritable bowel syndrome. But you also see it affecting things like depression and anxiety. And probably they say 90-95% of the dopamine and serotonin that's produced by the body is actually produced in the gut. And so the balance in your gut microbiome may be critically involved in cognitive function as well as what's going on in the digestive system itself. So we're just now learning the impact that fasting has and the effect that microbiome has and the relationship that those two things have together.
There was a 2024 study that found after a 7-day water-only fast, levels of harmful fusobacteria dropped by more than 80%, and the gut microbiome shifted to a healthier balance. So it's clearly doing some of the work to wipe out some of the bad, unhealthy gut microbiome bacteria, which gives you an opportunity to, I guess, reset the gut microbiome, which is really interesting. Especially if you, as you say, you have some of those sort of gut-centric diseases. Is there a gender component to this between sort of men and women? Because obviously women have menstrual cycles and certain hormone fluctuations that men don't have. So do you have to think about gender when you're thinking about fasting?
Well, we know that women have complicated systems in different ways than men, and they have different diseases too that show up. Fibrocystic breast disease, dysmenorrhea, menorrhagia, polycystic ovarian syndrome, all of these conditions that males don't know anything about seem to be associated with excess estradiol hormones. When estradiol is high, there's a higher association with many of these conditions. Estradiol normally breaks down to something called estriol, and it's excreted in the urine. And what breaks it down is the gut microbiome and liver function. And the gut microbiome and liver function are both profoundly affected by fasting. For example, we've got in studies we've done looking at fatty liver disease, we show significant changes and reversal of fatty liver disease with fasting. And as I mentioned, the gut microbiome goes through a whole kind of rebooting. And that may be why patients that come in with those symptoms, the fibrocystic breast disease, the dysmenorrhea, the menorrhagia, et cetera, often get profound short-term improvement and long-term benefit post-fasting. Now, all of these things I'd have to say, fasting is great, but unless it's a motivating factor to make the diet and lifestyle changes, I wouldn't be optimistic about long-term outcomes. When we use fasting, we're also providing intense education to try to get people motivated to adopt healthy diet and lifestyle habits. And it's those diet and lifestyle habits that are going to be necessary to sustain the benefits. I mean, I'll give you an example in lymphoma, which is a type of cancer. We published a paper in the British Medical Journal, case reports on a young woman who had follicular lymphoma, had progressed for a couple of years. And interestingly enough, her doctor, her oncologist, told her that diet didn't matter. The diet wasn't related to this particular type of cancer. She could eat whatever she wanted to. But nonetheless, she decided to come in rather than go through chemotherapy and underwent fasting. And we did 3 weeks of fasting, during which time you could literally feel these tumors disappearing. She had her follow-up CT scan. And at a year, we submitted this case report. And it was interesting because BMJ said, well, maybe she got lucky. I mean, yes, it progressed for 2 years. Yes, it went away in 21 days of fasting. But maybe, it was just naturally the time for it to go into remission. A small percentage of lymphoma patients do go through spontaneous remission. So they said, why don't you follow her for 3 years and see whether she can sustain that? Because we can treat lymphoma with drugs and the tumors will go down, but they tend to come back. And that's the problem. It doesn't really reduce necessarily all-cause mortality because the condition isn't actually resolved. So we followed her for 3 years, and I told her that she had to stick strictly to the dietary protocol or it would be fatal because I'd track her down and kill her. And she did stick to the diet. And at 3 years, we have CT evidence that she was cancer-free. And we submitted that to BMJ. And interestingly enough, at first they rejected the follow-up that they invited. And we kind of appealed that. And eventually they did decide to publish the follow-up. And then we followed her for 10 years. And she continues to be cancer-free. And she continues to follow a whole plant food SOS-free diet. And she went public with her story. She told some podcasts about what her experience was. And so we got a lot of lymphoma patients coming to TrueNorth Health. And now we've published a case series, which is a series of lymphoma patients, including one particular gentleman that was even more progressive. It was the stage 4. It had already metastasized into the bones. He had failed chemotherapy. He also did well. And we did a 3-week fast with him. Interestingly enough, his oncologist was quite antagonistic because he was concerned the fasting would make him too weak for treatment. But he came in, he did the treatment, did well, went back to the oncologist who said, wow, that's really impressive. Why don't you go back and do some more of that? He came back, we did another 39-day fast, and he was able to get dramatic improvement. And again, those studies have been published in peer-reviewed journals.
But he didn't go into remission?
With lymphoma, it would be considered remission, but it's not a cure. It's just like you can't cure lymphoma any more than you can cure obesity. You can lose the weight and keep it off, but if you go back to doing the things that cause it, it's coming back. You can't cure high blood pressure. You can normalize the pressure. I've got people who have been normal pressure for decades now. But if they go back to eating the greasy, fatty, slimy, salty, processed food, it'll come back because you're managing it. You're not curing it. The whole concept of a cure is a little bit of a misnomer. In medicine, cure just means you're alive 5 years after treatment. It doesn't mean that you've actually resolved the underlying cause of the condition.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.